I came home to a scene straight out of a low-budget crime flick, except the culprits weren't masked bandits. They were worse HOA goons. My workshop door hung off its hinges like a drunk leaning on a lamppost, and inside, two guys in khakis and clipboards were tearing through my sanctuary, yelling about HOA orders. That's when things got interesting. I'm John Thompson, 50 years old, a retired engineer who traded circuit boards for wood grain in Oakwood Estates, a Midwest suburb where the HOA rules with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of community standards. My workshop, a humble shed behind my house, is my escape. It's where I craft tables and chairs, each piece sanded smoother than a politician's promises. The smell of sawdust is my therapy. The hum of my table saw my symphony. But to the Oakwood Estates HOA, it's a blight on their Stepford wives' vision of uniformity. That afternoon I pulled into my driveway, my old pickup rattling like my joints, and noticed the workshop door ajar. My first thought was raccoons. Those furry bandits had raided my trash last month. But then I heard voices, not the chittering of critters but the self-important drone of middle management. I crept closer, my work boots crunching on the gravel, and peeked inside. There they were, Dave and Greg, the OA's dynamic duo of petty tyranny, rummaging through my tools like they owned the place. Dave, a wiry guy with a calm over that screamed midlife crisis, was waving a printed copy of the HOA rulebook like it was the Declaration of Independence. Section 5.3. All structures must maintain a uniform appearance. He bellowed as if my shed's slightly faded paint was a personal affront. Greg, his doughy sidekick with a mustache that looked like it was glued on for a community theater production, was scribbling notes on a clipboard, muttering about violations. Then, to my horror, Dave grabbed my table saw, my prized possession, a DeWalt I'd saved for months to buy, and declared it evidence of my crimes. Evidence, I roared, storming in. The only crime here is your fashion sense, Dave Caucus in 2025. Bold choice. They spun around startled, but recovered with the smugness of men who think a badge from a homeowners association makes them Navy SEALs. John Thompson, Greg said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Your workshop is unsightly, and the noise from your tools violates Section 8.1. No excessive noise or disturbance. Unsightly. I shot back. Have you seen your mustache, Greg? It's like a caterpillar crawled onto your face and died. Dave smirked, undeterred. We have the right to inspect for violations. This shed is a disgrace, and your sawing keeps the neighborhood awake. Awake, I laughed. The only thing keeping people awake is Karen's yapping dog at 3 a.m., and you don't seem to care about that. Karen, the HOA president, was the puppet master behind these two. A woman who'd probably fine you for breathing too loudly. I tried to keep my cool, but my blood was boiling. This wasn't just about a shed or a saw. It was about my space, my passion, my right to exist without some clipboard-wielding bureaucrat telling me my life was non-compliant. I pointed at the door, which now sported a fresh boot mark. You kicked in my door. That's trespassing, geniuses. Greg puffed out his chest, which only made his polo shirt strain against his beer gut. Section 10.2 grants us inspection rights, he said, though his eyes darted to Dave for confirmation. Section 10.2 can kiss my. I stopped myself. Deep breath. John, don't give them the satisfaction. You're on private property. Get out. Dave chuckled, a sound as grating as a dull blade on oak. We'll leave when we're done. And we're taking this saw for documentation. He hefted it like he was auditioning for a strongman competition, though he nearly dropped it on his foot. That's when I noticed the neighbors starting to gather. Old Mrs. Jenkins peered over her fence, her curlers bobbing like antennae. Tom, my next-door neighbor and a former cop, leaned against his mailbox, shaking his head. A couple of kids on bikes stopped to gawk. It was turning into a circus, and I was the reluctant ringmaster. Has your HOA ever crossed the line like this? I muttered under my breath, imagining a crowd of fed-up homeowners nodding in solidarity.
Share your story in the comments.
Are you watching on your phone, TV, or laptop? Let me know where you are and what time it is there. Okay, maybe I wasn't actually streaming this, but it felt like the kind of moment that deserved an audience. I turned back to the intruders. You're not taking my saw, Dave. Put it down before you hurt yourself, or before I call the cops. Greg scoffed. Go ahead. The HOA is above the law. I blinked. Above the law? What are you, the mafia? You're a glorified book club with a budget for lawn signs. Dave ignored me, snapping photos of my workbench with his phone. This clutter is a violation too. Section 7.4, no disorganized storage. Clutter, I said. That's art, you Philistine. Every tool has a place, unlike that hairpiece you're trying to pass off as natural. The truth is, they had no right to be there. I'd read the CCNRs, those soul-crushing covenants, conditions, and restrictions, when I bought the house. HOAs can't just barge onto your property without permission unless it's explicitly stated, and Oakwood's rules didn't grant them stormtrooper privileges. This was trespassing, plain and simple, and I knew it. But Dave and Greg were high on their own power, drunk on the authority of their laminated badges. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Last chance, leave, or I'm calling someone who'll make you wish you'd stayed home playing HOA bingo. Dave sneered. Ooh, your lawyer. Good luck, the co always wins. I smiled, pulling out my phone. Not my lawyer, my son. As I dialed Mike, my 25-year-old black belt in Jiu-Jitsu. I couldn't help but grin. Dave and Greg thought they were untouchable, but they were about to learn a lesson in humility. And I was going to enjoy every second of it. Things were heating up, and I knew I needed backup. Dave and Greg, the HOA's self-appointed stormtroopers, were still in my workshop, treating my tools like evidence in a CSI episode. My shed, once a haven of sawdust and solitude, now felt like a stage for their petty power trip. I'd asked them to leave, but they doubled down, waving their rulebook like it was a lightsaber. My blood pressure was climbing faster than a squirrel up an oak, but I kept my cool, barely. This was Oakwood Estates, where the HOA's word was law, and I was just a retired engineer with a knack for woodworking. Or so they thought. Dave, the calm-over king, was snapping photos of my workbench, muttering about Section 7.4, no disorganized storage. His phone flashed like he was paparazzi at a Kardashian wedding. Greg, meanwhile, was delivering a sermon on community standards, his mustache twitching with every syllable. Your noise disrupts the neighborhood, John, he droned, sounding like a DMV clerk rejecting my license renewal. And this shed, it's an eyesore. Section 5.3 demands uniformity. Uniformity, I scoffed, leaning against a stack of cedar planks. Greg, your shirt's so tight it's screaming for mercy. That's the real eyesore here. The neighbors, now a small crowd by the fence, snickered. Old Mrs. Jenkins clutched her garden gnome like it was a lifeline, while Tom, my ex-cop neighbor, gave me a nod that said, "You've got this." But Dave wasn't laughing. He tripped over my toolbox while posing for another violation photo, his clipboard clattering to the floor. Careful, Dave, I said, grinning. You're one stumble away from a workers' comp claim. The crowd chuckled louder, and I swear one of the kids on bikes started filming. This was turning into Oakwood's version of a reality show, and I was the reluctant star. I tried reasoning again, mostly to keep myself from yeeting their rulebook into the next county. Look, you're trespassing. The CCNRs don't give you the right to barge in and play sheriff. Get out, or I'm calling the cops. I was bluffing about the cops for now. I didn't want sirens and paperwork. I wanted these clowns gone. Greg's voice cracked like he was auditioning for a boy band. We're within our rights, Thompson. Section 10.2, right of inspection. He clutched the rulebook to his chest like a shield. Dave, recovering from his toolbox fumble, chimed in, and we're documenting this saw. It's coming with us. My saw. I laughed, a sharp, dangerous sound. Touch it again, Dave, and you'll need a new comb over to cover the bruises. The crowd oohed, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just about my workshop anymore. It was about every time the HOA had fined someone for a crooked mailbox or an unapproved flower pot. It was personal. Tom sidled up, his voice low. They've gone too far, John. Karen's behind this, you know. Karen, the HOA president, was the puppet master, a woman who'd probably alphabetize her spice rack for fun. Tom's words lit a fire in me. I pulled out my phone and dialed Mike, my 25-year-old son, a Jiu-Jitsu black belt who lived 10 minutes away. Hey kid, I said when he picked up. Got a couple of HOA goons in my shop. Could use your expertise. On my way, Dad, Mike said, his voice calm but edged with something that made me smile. I hung up and faced the intruders. You've got 5 minutes to leave, or things get interesting. Dave sneered, undeterred. What, you gonna sick your dog on us? He gestured at my empty yard, clearly thinking he'd landed a zinger. Nope, I said, crossing my just now, but they weren't budging. Dave was back to snapping photos, muttering about fines that make my wallet weep. Greg, emboldened, started lecturing again. We could shut this workshop down, Thompson. Non-compliance is a serious offense. Shut it down, I said, incredulous. What's next, Greg? Confiscating my sandpaper. Banning my coffee maker for excessive aroma. The neighbors laughed, and I caught Tom shaking his head, muttering, idiots. I knew HOAs could fine for violations, unapproved sheds, noisy tools, but shutting down private property. That was Karen-level delusion. The CC&Rs required due process, notices, hearings. These guys were freelancing and I was done playing nice. Dave, sensing the crowd's mood, got cocky. You'll be hearing from our lawyer, he said, jabbing a finger at me. Fines, liens, maybe even foreclosure if you keep this up. Foreclosure, I said, stepping closer. Dave, the only thing getting foreclosed is your self-esteem. Look at you, sweating through your polo like it's a sauna. The crowd roared, and Dave's face turned the color of my cherrywood stain. Greg tried to back him up, but his voice cracked again, making him sound like a cartoon villain. We're serious, John. Oh, I'm terrified, I said, rolling my eyes. What's the fine for sarcasm? Section 12.5. The kids on bikes were definitely filming now, and I could almost hear the TikTok likes piling up. I glanced at my watch. Mike would be here any second, and these two were about to regret their life choices. I leaned against the workbench, feigning calm. You know, I've dealt with bigger bullies than you. Like the time my boss tried to make me work weekends. Spoilered, I'm retired now and he's still clocking in. The crowd chuckled, but Dave wasn't amused. He grabbed my table saw again, hefting it like he was actually going to walk out with it. Put it down, I said, my voice low. Dave hesitated, then smirked, setting it back but not before knocking over a can of wood stain. The lid popped off, splattering his khakis. Oops, I said, not even trying to hide my grin. That's gonna stain, buddy. Greg, panicking, tried to salvage their dignity. You'll pay for this, Thompson? The HOA board will. Will what? I cut him off. Send more of you to trip over my tools. Bring it on. I was stalling, buying time for Mike, but the truth was, I was enjoying this. Dave and Greg were unraveling, their authority crumbling like a poorly glued veneer. The neighbors were on my side, and the air crackled with anticipation. Then I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Mike's Jeep pulled into the driveway, and my grin widened. Game over. Boys, I muttered. Dave and Greg didn't know it yet, but they were about to meet a black belt with zero patience for clipboard warriors. And I was ready to watch the show. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my son showed up. And he wasn't alone. The air in my workshop was thick with tension, sawdust, and the faint whiff of Dave's desperation-soaked khakis. Dave and Greg, the OA's khaki-clad crusaders, were still strutting around like they owned my shed, snapping photos and spouting rulebook nonsense. My neighbors, now a full-blown audience, watched from the fence like this was the Midwest's hottest pay-per-view event. I'd called my son Mike a 25-year-old Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and as his Jeep rolled into the driveway, I felt a surge of glee. The HOA goons were about to learn that their laminated badges didn't mean squat against a guy who could tie you in a knot faster than you could say. Section 10.2. Mike stepped out, all lean muscle and calm confidence, his friend Jake right behind him. Jake, another Jiu-Jitsu expert, had a grin that said he'd seen scarier things in a dojo warm up. They strolled toward the workshop, moving with the easy swagger of guys who knew they could end this in seconds, but were polite enough to give the bad guys a chance to run. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, Mrs. Jenkins clutching her gnome tighter, Tom nodding approval. The kids on bikes were definitely filming now, probably dreaming of viral fame. I waved. Mike, Jake, meet Dave and Greg, Oakwood Estate's finest clipboard warriors. They think my shed's a felony and my table saw's a fugitive. Mike's eyes flicked to the kicked-in door, then to Dave, who was still clutching my saw like it was a hostage. You guys lost? Mike asked, his voice as smooth as my best, sanded tabletop. This is private property. Dave laughed, a nasal snort that made me want to sand his face. This is HOA business, kid. Stay out of it. He puffed out his chest, which only highlighted how his come-over was losing its battle with gravity. Greg, emboldened by Dave's bravado, chimed in, his mustache quivering like a nervous caterpillar. Section 10.2, Right of Inspection. We're authorized to be here. He waved the rule book, but his hand shook slightly, betraying the fact that he was about as intimidating as a soggy paper towel. Jake smirked, leaning against the workbench. I've seen less drama in a cage match, fellas. You sure you want to play this game? I couldn't help myself. Yeah, Greg. Your mustache's putting up a better fight than you are. The crowd snickered, and one of the bike kids yelled, "Burn!" This was better than Netflix, and I was living for it. Mike, ever the diplomat, kept his cool. You're trespassing, he said, stepping closer. No notice, no permission. That's not in your precious CCNRs. Show me some ID, and maybe we can talk. Dave blinked, caught off guard. ID. We're with the O. He sputtered, as if that was a golden ticket to Narnia. Greg fumbled with his badge, holding it up like a shield. This is all you need to see. Mike tilted his head, reading the badge. Dave Peterson, HOA enforcement officer. Cute. Doesn't change the fact that you're breaking the law. Leave, or we'll make you. I reached for my phone, ready to call the cops for real this time. I'm done with this circus, I muttered. But Mike raised a hand, stopping me. Let's handle this ourselves first, Dad. His tone was calm, but his eyes had that glint I'd seen before, like when he'd pinned a cocky sparring partner in under 10 seconds. Dave and Greg were toast, and they didn't even know it. The crowd was buzzing now, sensing the showdown. Tom whispered to Mrs. Jenkins, "This is gonna be good." Even the kids on bikes stopped their commentary. Phones raised like they were filming the Super Bowl. I leaned back against a stack of cedar, savoring the moment. "You boys might want to rethink your life choices," I said. "My son's not big on repeat warnings." Dave, either too stubborn or too stupid to read the room, scoffed. "You think you scare us, kid? We've got the HOA board behind us. Karen's gonna bury you in fines." Karen, I laughed. The woman who fined me for excessive grass height during a drought. Yeah, I'm trembling. The crowd chuckled, and I could almost hear the collective eye roll from every neighbor who'd ever gotten a passive, aggressive letter from her. Jake cracked his knuckles, more for show than necessity. "You're not inspectors, you're trespassers, and you're about to have a bad day." His grin was pure mischief, like a cat toying with a particularly dumb mouse. Greg, sensing the shift, tried to de-escalate, but his voice cracked again, making him sound like a puberty-stricken cartoon character. "We're just doing our job!" Section 5.3, Section 8.1. "There are rules, I said, stepping forward. "Like not kicking in my door, or not stealing my saw. You're not the law, Greg. You're a glorified hall monitor with a clipboard." The crowd roared, and I felt like a stand-up comic nailing the punchline. This was my moment, and I was milking it. Mike, still calm as a Zen monk, pointed at the door. Last chance. Walk away, keep your dignity. Or stay, and we'll see how fast you can limp. Dave's face turned the color of my cherrywood stain. You're nobody, he snapped. This is our turf. He gestured wildly, knocking over a can of screws that scattered across the floor like tiny landmines. The crowd gasped, then laughed as Dave cursed and tried to scoop them up, his calm overflopping like a sad flag. I couldn't resist. Nice moves, Dave. You training for the HOA Olympics? Gold and clumsiness, maybe. The bike kids were losing it, one of them yelling.
Post it?
I was starting to think this might actually go viral. Mike stepped closer, his presence filling the room. You're not welcome here, he said, his voice low but sharp. Leave or we'll remove you. Greg looked at Dave, clearly hoping for a bailout, but Dave was too busy trying to salvage his pride. You'll regret this, he muttered, clutching the rule book like it was a life raft. The HOA always wins. I grinned, glancing at Mike and Jake. Funny thing about always Dave. There's a first time for everything. The crowd was electric, the air crackling with anticipation. Dave and Greg were cornered, their authority crumbling faster than a poorly glued veneer. Mike and Jake stood ready, and I knew what was coming. These HOA clowns were about to get a lesson they'd never forget, and I had a front row seat. That's when Mike decided to show them what real power looks like. The workshop was a powder keg with Dave and Greg, the HOA's self-proclaimed enforcers, still clinging to their rulebook like it was a holy relic. My son Mike and his friend Jake, both Jiu-Jitsu black belts, stood calm but ready, their presence a quiet promise of chaos for anyone dumb enough to test them. The neighbors, now a full-blown peanut gallery, leaned over fences and filmed with phones, turning my backyard into Oakwood Estate's version of a gladiator arena. Dave's calm overflapped in the breeze, Greg's mustache twitched like a nervous squirrel, and I was savoring every second of their impending doom. Dave, either too arrogant or too clueless to sense the trap, made the fatal mistake. He shoved Mike, his bony hand jabbing my son's chest as he snarled, "Back off, kid." The crowd gasped, Mrs. Jenkins nearly dropping her gnome. I grinned so wide my face hurt. Big mistake, Dave. Huge. Mike moved like a cobra, fluid and precise. In a blink, he grabbed Dave's wrist, stepped to the side, and executed a textbook hip throw. Dave hit the floor with a thud that rattled my workbench, his rule book skittering across the sawdust. Before he could yelp, Mike had him in an armbar, his knee pinning Dave's chest. "You done?" Mike asked, calm as if he were ordering coffee. The crowd erupted, cheers and whoops echoing through the yard. One of the bike kids yelled, "World Star," and I swear Tom, my ex-cop neighbor, was wiping a tear of pride. I leaned against a stack of cedar, cackling. "Nice form, Dave!" "You stick the landing, or does your calm over need a recount?" Greg, panicking, decided to play hero. He lunged at Jake with a war cry that sounded more like a startled goose. Jake didn't even blink. He sidestepped, swept Greg's legs, and had him pinned in a chokehold faster than you could say. Section 10.2. Greg's clipboard clattered to the ground, his mustache practically wilting under the pressure. Jake grinned down at him. "Tap out, buddy, or you're napping out." The neighbors were losing it, phones raised like they were filming the moon landing. Mrs. Jenkins was clapping so hard her curlers bounced, and the bike kids were chanting, "Jiu-Jitsu! Jiu-Jitsu!" It was chaos, glorious chaos, and I was the conductor of this symphony of payback. Mike, still holding Dave in the armbar, looked up. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "Leave now, or we call the cops. Your choice." He tightened the hold just enough to make Dave squeak, a sound I'd treasure forever. Dave, red-faced and gasping, managed to croak, "This isn't over, we'll sue." His calm over was now a full-blown casualty, flopped over his ear like a defeated flag. Greg, still pinned, wheezed, "You'll regret this, Thompson." I laughed so hard I nearly choked. "Sue." "Dave, you couldn't sue a lemonade stand. You kicked in my door, stole my saw, and got your ass handed to you. Good luck finding a lawyer who'll touch that." The crowd roared, and I caught Tom nodding, muttering, "Idiots." Jake loosened his hold on Greg, just enough to let him breathe. "Sure thing, buddy," he said, smirking. "Just don't trip on your way out, again." He gave a mock salute, and the crowd howled. Greg's polo was soaked with sweat, his dignity as crumpled as his clipboard. Mike released Dave, stepping back but staying ready. Dave staggered to his feet, clutching his arm like he'd survived a bear attack. Greg scrambled up, grabbing his badge from the floor, though it was now bent and covered in sawdust. They stumbled toward the door, the crowd parting to let them pass, jeering like they were booing a bad comedian offstage. I couldn't resist one last jab. "Hey, Dave, leave the badge! You've earned a dishonorable discharge from the HOA Army!" The neighbors cackled, and Dave shot me a glare that might have been scary if he didn't look like a drowned rat. Greg muttered something about Karen and fines, but his voice was so shaky it sounded like he was auditioning for a sad trombone. As they reached the driveway, Dave turned, pointing a shaky finger.
"You're done, Thompson. The HOA will crush you."
He tried to storm off but tripped over a garden hose sprawling onto the grass. The crowd exploded, and Jake called out, "Gold medal in clumsiness, Dave! You nailed it!" Mike dusted off his hands, turning to me. "You okay, Dad?" His calm was almost infuriating. "How do you stay that cool after tossing a guy like a salad?" "Better than ever," I said, clapping his shoulder. "You boys just made my year." Jake grinned, picking up the fallen rulebook and tossing it into a pile of wood scraps. "Souvenir?" he asked, and I laughed. The neighbors swarmed us, offering high fives and stories of their own nightmares. Tom shook Mike's hand, saying, "Remind me not to piss you off." Mrs. Jenkins, still clutching her gnome, declared, "I'm baking you boys a pie." The bike kids were already uploading their videos, one of them muttering about million views. Easy. I looked at my busted door, the scattered screws, the spilled wood stain on Dave's cactus still drying in the sun. This wasn't just a win. It was a masterpiece. Dave and Greg had come in like conquerors and left like clowns, their HOA badges as worthless as their threats. I knew Karen, the puppet master, was behind this, and I couldn't wait to see her squirm when she heard how her goons got schooled. Anyone else had an HOA try to ruin their day? I said to the crowd, half joking, "Share your stories below, and tell me you watching this on your phone, TV, or laptop. What time is it where you are?" Okay, I wasn't actually streaming, but this felt like a moment that deserved to go viral. The energy was electric, the kind of triumph that makes you want to crank Springsteen and crack a beer. Mike and Jake stood by the workbench, scanning the yard like bodyguards. I knew this wasn't over. Karen wouldn't take this lying down. But for now, we'd won. The workshop was mine, my saw was safe, and Dave's over was probably filing for unemployment. I glanced at the crowd, their cheers still ringing in my ears, and thought, this is what justice feels like. And it felt damn good. Justice was served, but the story didn't end there. The dust had barely settled in my workshop, still littered with screws and the faint scent of Dave's defeated caucus, when the fallout from our HOA showdown began to ripple through Oakwood Estates. My son Mike and his friend Jake, the Jiu-Jitsu dude who'd turned Dave and Greg into human pretzels, had left the scene like action heroes, but the neighborhood was buzzing like a hive kicked over by a bear. The neighbors' phones were still glowing with videos of Dave's face, plant, and Greg's mustache meltdown, and I knew this was about to get bigger than my best table saw. By the next morning, the clip of Mike's hip throw had gone viral on X, racking up thousands of views and comments like, "Cho got Odoland!" and "Come over guy needs a new job." The bike kids, now local legends, were strutting around like they'd directed a Spielberg blockbuster. I sat on my porch with a coffee, scrolling through the posts, grinning like a kid who'd just TP'd the principal's house. If you've ever faced an overreaching HOA, Share your story below. I muttered to myself, imagining the flood of replies. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. Phone, TV, or laptop? Okay, I wasn't hosting a live stream, but this felt like a moment that deserved a global audience. The HOA board, caught off guard by their goons' public humiliation, called an emergency meeting that evening. I showed up at the community center, Mike and Jake flanking me like bodyguards while neighbors packed the room, some still chuckling over the viral video. The board, a grim-faced lineup of Karen clones and golf shirt guys, sat at a folding table, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen herself, the HOA president and my personal nemesis, was front and center, her lips pursed so tight they could have cracked walnuts. The meeting was a circus. Karen tried to spin the incident as a miscommunication, claiming Dave and Greg were overzealous volunteers, acting without her approval. I nearly snorted my water across the room. Overzealous, I said, standing up. They kicked in my door. Karen, unless your rule book has a chapter on breaking and entering, that's not a miscommunication, it's a crime. The crowd murmured agreement, and I caught Tom, my ex-cop neighbor, nodding like a proud coach. Mike leaned forward, his voice calm but cutting. You sent them to my dad's workshop without notice or permission. That's trespassing. Want to explain why? The room went quiet, and Karen's face turned the color of my cherry wood stain. She stammered something about community standards, but the neighbors weren't buying it. Mrs. Jenkins, still clutching her gnome like a talisman, yelled,
You owe John an apology.
The board, sensing a mutiny, scrambled to save face. They revealed that Karen had personally ordered the inspection, after a single anonymous complaint, probably her own, knowing her. The CC&Rs required written notice and homeowner consent for inspections, and Karen had skipped both steps, thinking her HOA crown made her untouchable. Big mistake. The crowd was ready to storm the table with pitchforks, or at least some strongly worded petitions. By the end of the night, Karen was forced to resign, her exit as graceful as Dave's trip over my garden hose. Her resignation letter, read aloud by a sweating board member, was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive drivel. Due to misunderstandings and overzealous actions, I stepped down to focus on community healing. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. Healing? I whispered to Mike. She's probably plotting her comeback as HOA dictator at a condo in Florida. Jake smirked, muttering, Bet she's already fining seagulls for excessive squawking. The board issued a public apology, promising to review their inspection policies and sending me a check for the busted door. Barely enough to cover a new hinge, but I framed it like a trophy. More importantly, the neighbors rallied around me. Tom started a petition to loosen the OA's grip, demanding fewer rules about sheds, noise, and unapproved lawn gnomes. By the next week, it had more signatures than Karen's last birthday card. The viral video kept spreading, sparking X threads about HOA horror stories from across the country. I was a folk hero, the guy who'd taken down the clipboard tyrants with a black belt and a bad attitude. Then came the twist that made it personal. Tom Ever the Slith dug into Karen's past and dropped a bombshell. She was my high school rival, the girl who'd snitched on me for sneaking a frog into biology class, costing me a week of detention. Back then, she'd been a hall monitor with a power trip. Now, she was an OA president with a vendetta. It explained why she'd targeted my workshop, pure, petty revenge for a prank from 1975. I laughed until my sides hurt. Karen, I said to Mike, you held a grudge for 50 years over a frog. That's commitment. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the victory. She thought she could bully me again. I told Jake. But she forgot I've got a son who can flip a grown man like a pancake. Mike chuckled, shaking his head. The workshop was mine again, my saw humming like nothing had happened. The neighbors started calling me the shed defender, and I wasn't mad about it. The HOA was quieter after that, like a dog that'd been swatted with a newspaper. The new board was too scared to pull another stunt, and the petition gained traction, loosening rules that had choked the life out of Oakwood. I even got a pie from Mrs. Jenkins, though her gnome still gave me the creeps. The viral video hit 1 million views, with comments calling Mike and Jake HOA slayers. I was prouder than the day Mike got his black belt. As I sanded a new table in my workshop, I thought about every homeowner who'd ever gotten a snide HOA letter. If you've dealt with a Karen or a Dave, I muttered, imagining the X thread. Tell me how you fought back. Phone, TV, or laptop. What's your setup? The saw hummed, the wood smoothed under my hands, and I felt like a king. Karen was gone, Dave's calm-over was unemployed, and Greg's mustache was probably in therapy. My workshop stood tall, a middle finger to every petty tyrant who thought they could rule my life. And that, my friends, was a revenge story for the ages.